The most profound fractures in a marriage don't announce themselves with the shattering of glass or the raising of a voice. They slip in quietly. They wear the disguise of an ordinary afternoon until you realize the cold has already settled deep into your bones. The Grand Conservatory was a masterpiece of historic iron and curved glass. It was perched on the edge of a rain-swept lake. Tonight, under the suffocating weight of a late autumn storm, it felt like a beautifully constructed cage. Heavy winter rain drummed relentlessly against the panoramic windows. It occasionally thickened into wet snow. Beyond the glass, the last surviving red roses of the season were slowly being buried under the frost. I stood near the eastern wall, and my posture was perfectly composed. For 5 years, I had been the invisible architect of my husband's empire. I was the quiet diplomat who smoothed over the jagged edges of a brutal syndicate. I mapped out the logistics of these summits. I maintained the fragile truces that kept Dante's transactional business afloat. Tonight was the Regional Peace Summit. It was a gathering where respect was measured in millimeters. Beside me, Gemma Rossi, the estate's longtime housekeeper, aligned the silver spoons. She placed them beside a cold crystal tea set. Gemma's hands were weathered by years of maintaining the pristine illusion of the Morone household. The older woman didn't speak. In this world, survival meant knowing exactly when to stay quiet. I reached out and brushed the fragile porcelain of the jasmine teacup. It was my personal cup. It was a quiet luxury I kept nearby during negotiations. The rim was freezing to the touch. I traced the delicate gold pattern along the edge, and my gaze drifted back to the storm outside. The chill of the porcelain mirrored the temperature of my marriage. The silence between me and Dante Morone hadn't happened overnight. It expanded gradually. It claimed one room, and one missed dinner at a time. Eventually, we lived entirely separate lives under the same roof. Tracing the cold rim, I recognized a devastating truth. This quiet, measured distance was more destructive than any open threat. A rival family's hostility could be countered, but a husband's complete indifference left you fighting a ghost. "The side tables are prepared, Signora," Gemma murmured softly. The housekeeper folded the last linen napkin, and her eyes briefly met mine. There was a profound, unspoken grief in the older woman's gaze. "Thank you, Gemma," I answered. My voice was even. I released the jasmine teacup and turned my attention to the center of the vast pavilion. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the conservatory swung open. Dante stepped through the threshold. He wore his authority like a tailored suit. It was flawless and entirely impenetrable. Dante believed in modern power. He mistook petty dominance for strength. He viewed my quiet competence not as an asset, but as an uncomfortable reminder of his own dependence. Behind him walked Marco Valletti, his senior captain. Marco was a broad-shouldered enforcer. He was eager to please, and entirely oblivious to the delicate ecosystem he was entering. The primary family table sat directly beneath the massive central chandelier. It was a long stretch of polished mahogany. For half a decade, my place had always been to Dante's immediate right. It was a position of undeniable respect. It was a testament to my role in holding the family together. I watched my husband approach the table. Dante carried a heavy portfolio. He moved with a practiced arrogance, and his shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. He stopped at the head of the table. He didn't look toward the eastern wall where I was standing in the shadows. With a fluid motion, he opened the portfolio and withdrew the Morone place card. It was a ceremoniously seating ledger meant to represent the family's unified front. The gold-trimmed card bore Dante's name at the very top, followed directly by the names of his captains. My name was conspicuously absent. It had been intentionally erased from the official record. Then Dante turned to the physical seating arrangement. He gestured for Marco to take the heavy high-back chair to his immediate right. This was my traditional seat. The dismissal wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated erasure. Dante stepped back, subtly adjusting his cuff. He shifted his stance. He deliberately used his captain's bulk as a shield between himself and the edge of the room. He refused to make eye contact with me. It was an act of cowardice wrapped in public authority. He wanted to strip me of my standing. But he lacked the courage to look me in the eyes while doing it. Marco was unaware of the silent earthquake he was standing at the epicenter of. He simply nodded and pulled out the chair. He sat down in the space that belonged to me. A lesser woman might have marched across the marble floor. A different wife might have demanded an explanation, or allowed the humiliation to manifest in immediate tears. I did none of these things. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something fundamental had already ended. I watched the man I had spent 5 years protecting deliberately erase me from his world. I didn't feel the sudden sting of rejection. Instead, an absolute clarity settled over my mind. As cold as the winter storm outside, he had just made his choice. The air near the entrance of the historic pavilion carried a sharp and damp chill. It was far removed from the warmth radiating near the center of the room. Rain continued to drum a relentless, heavy rhythm against the vaulted glass ceiling. It sent thin and shivering shadows across the polished marble floor. I didn't move toward the heat. I remained exactly where I was, a few paces from the threshold. I was standing in the direct line of sight of every syndicate leader entering the building. To flee would be a confession of shame. To demand a chair from a passing waiter would turn a deliberate insult into a chaotic public spectacle. Instead, I let my stillness do the work. I kept my spine perfectly straight. I rested my hands lightly over the small silver clasp of my evening bag. I didn't cross my arms against the cold. I didn't look down at the intricate mosaic beneath my feet. I simply watched the room around me. The underworld aristocracy arrived in waves. Men in heavy cashmere overcoats brushed past. The scent of damp wool, cedar water, and expensive cigars drifted through the drafty corridor. Underbosses and captains from neighboring territories paused as they handed off their dripping umbrellas. They were men who had built empires on quiet observation. They saw the Marone table. They saw Marco leaning back in the seat that had always belonged to me. He was laughing at something Dante had just said. Then they looked back at me, standing alone in the shadows. A lesser woman might have folded under the weight of those shifting, calculating glances. I felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. Every second I stood there, perfectly composed and utterly silent, the narrative shifted. Dante believed he was projecting dominance by proving he didn't need his wife at the summit. He thought he was showing the room that he answered to no one. People often mistake politeness for peace. They are not the same thing. The older men from the Western territories exchanged quiet nods with my husband as they passed his table. But their eyes remained deeply troubled. They valued order. They valued the appearance of a united family. A man who would publicly discard the woman holding the ledgers of his shipping terminals was a man who couldn't be trusted with a regional treaty. My breathing remained slow and measured. The chill from the marble slowly seeped through the soles of my shoes and crept up my legs. Across the room, Dante finally glanced in my direction. He expected to see me shrinking against the wall, or perhaps turning to leave the conservatory entirely. Instead, he met a gaze completely empty of distress. I gave him nothing. There was no panic, no tears, and no silent plea for rescue. There was just the steady, unblinking observation of a woman mapping an exit. The space between us felt like a chasm that could never be crossed again. He looked away first. A sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room signaled the arrival of the northern faction. The low murmur of conversation near the entrance abruptly ceased. It was replaced only by the steady drum of the winter storm outside. The heavy oak doors swung open wider, and Don Silvano Carresi stepped onto the polished stone. He was a man built from the old-world architecture of our business. He didn't rush. He didn't need to speak loudly to command the space. At 72, he moved with a deliberate and unhurried grace. His dark overcoat rested heavily on his shoulders. He paused on the threshold, bringing his silver-handled cane to rest on the ground. Behind him, a dozen lieutenants stopped in absolute synchronization. Silvano's eyes were sharp and predatory under heavy brows. They swept across the grand pavilion. He took the measure of the summit in a single practiced glance. He noted the placement of the tables and the proximity of the rival families. He noticed the nervous energy radiating from the younger bosses. He cataloged every detail with the precision of a jeweler appraising a flawed stone. His gaze slid over Dante, pausing for a fraction of a second on Marco sitting in the primary circle. Then he turned his head and saw me. We were only a few feet apart in the drafty entryway. I didn't lower my eyes, and he didn't immediately look away. The silence between us stretched. It was filled only by the sound of the rain against the glass overhead. The elderly patriarch didn't offer me a look of pity. Pity was useless in our world. Instead, his expression hardened into one of profound, almost surgical calculation. He was a man who understood that power wasn't just violence. It was structure. A wife who managed the logistics, who knew the schedules, the terminal codes, and the silent alliances, was the absolute foundation of the house. Dante had left his foundation standing in a cold hallway to prove a petty point. Silvano saw an unanchored asset. He saw a massive strategic vulnerability, left unguarded by an arrogant boy playing at being a king. Silvano slowly unbuttoned his coat. One of his men stepped forward instantly to take it, but the Don held up a single gloved hand, stopping the movement. He remained focused entirely on me. To my left, across the expanse of the room, the velvet guest chair waited at the head of the Carrese table. It was the highest seat of honor in his organization. It was traditionally reserved for visiting dignitaries, or the most respected elders of the commission. Tonight it sat conspicuously empty, and its dark upholstery absorbed the ambient light. It was a silent testament to the old Don's strict adherence to formal hierarchy. He adjusted his cufflink, and the gold glinted under the dim chandelier light. His lieutenants watched him, waiting for the order to move toward their designated section. Silvano shifted his weight, his cane tapping once against the stone. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse. Every movement was a negotiation. Every silence was a contract. Dante's crude neglect had created a vacuum. Silvano was steeped in the ancient etiquette of a syndicate that survived by recognizing value where others discarded it. He prepared to fill that void. He took one slow, deliberate step toward me. The rest of the room began to realize what was happening. The silver tip of Don Silvano Carrese's cane struck the polished marble floor in a rhythmic cadence. With every measured step the elderly patriarch took, the ambient noise of the expansive glass house bled away. The clinking of crystal glasses slowed to a halt. The low murmur of syndicate captains faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Soon the only remaining sound was the relentless winter rain lashing against the vaulted glass ceiling. I didn't shift my weight. I kept my hands folded lightly over my evening bag. I maintained the exact posture of a woman waiting for nothing. To reach the eastern wall where I stood, the Don had to pass directly by the primary family table. Protocol was rigid. When an elder of his rank entered a neutral summit, the hosting family was required to rise and offer the first greeting. Dante understood this. He adjusted the cuff of his dark suit, and his chin lifted in a practiced display of authority. He expected the traditional exchange of quiet pleasantries to visually validate his control over the regional peace. Marco was eager to perform his role as the newly elevated lieutenant. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, preparing to stand in a show of deference. They were both completely unprepared for the architecture of old-world disdain. Don Silvano didn't slow his pace. He didn't turn his head. His dark and predatory eyes remained locked entirely on me. As he approached, Marco half stood in an uncertain movement. Silvano walked past him as if the enforcer were empty space. Dante's hand twitched. It lifted toward a greeting that would never be acknowledged. The patriarch drifted past my husband without a single glance. His cashmere coat brushed the edge of the very chair Marco had taken from me. The dismissal was absolute. It wasn't a hostile glare or a whispered insult. It was a complete erasure of their existence. By walking past the reigning boss without so much as a nod, the elderly Don had publicly rendered Dante irrelevant. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Behind him, his lieutenants fanned out to create a physical barricade between us and the rest of the room. The men at my husband's table were now completely cut off from my line of sight. Silvano brought both hands to the silver handle of his cane. The deep lines of his face were unreadable, carved by decades of surviving betrayals. For a long moment, he simply looked at me. He observed the quiet composure in my posture and the total absence of panic in my eyes. Then he stepped back, planting his cane firmly against the marble. He lowered his head. It wasn't a polite nod, but a deep and formal bow. It was the kind of gesture reserved exclusively for visiting sovereigns. The slow and deliberate dip of his shoulders forced the entire conservatory to hold its breath. In a room obsessed with dominance, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, was bending his neck to a woman left standing in the shadows. When he straightened, the atmosphere in the glass pavilion had irrevocably altered. The older men from the Western territories stared at the scene with a profound understanding. A husband had tried to prove his strength by humiliating his wife. A rival was now proving his supremacy by elevating her. "Signora Marone," Silvano said. His voice was gravely, low and perfectly measured, yet it carried across the frozen silence of the room. "It is a bitter night to be standing so close to the cold glass." "The cold doesn't bother me, Don Carrese," I replied smoothly. My tone remained even, devoid of any tremor. "It offers a very clear view of the room." A faint glimmer of respect sparked in his dark eyes. I wasn't a victim seeking rescue. I was an observer cataloging a crumbling alliance. He gestured with one gloved hand toward the far side of the massive pavilion. The Carrese table sat draped in dark linen, glowing with the warmth of silver candelabras. At the head of that table rested the velvet guest chair. It was the undisputed seat of honor. It was a throne of carved mahogany, traditionally kept empty unless a figure of immense respect graced the family with their presence. A room that allows its foundation to stand in the shadows is a house preparing to collapse. Silvano continued, "My family values the architecture of peace. We value the hands that hold the ledgers and the dignity of a woman who understands the true weight of a treaty." Every word was a precision strike. He was listing the logistical assets I controlled. He was reminding the room that Dante wore the crown only because I maintained the roads it traveled on. Silvano's expression softened into exquisite courtliness. "My table has an empty chair, Signora. It is the highest honor of my house if you would grace us with your presence." The invitation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He offered me absolute validation in front of the people Dante had tried to impress. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dante push his chair back, wood scraping against marble. The color had drained from his face. His political allies, the men he intended to dazzle, now looked at him with undisguised disdain. A man who handed his greatest strategic asset to a rival out of petty ego was a fool. I looked at the velvet guest chair waiting across the room. It represented a boundary that, once crossed, would forever alter the balance of power in our marriage and our business. I didn't look at my husband. I looked directly into the eyes of the rival patriarch. "Thank you, Don Carrese," I said. My voice was quiet, carrying the finality of a closing door. "I would be honored to join you." The distance from the shadowed entrance to the center of the massive enclosure was exactly 34 steps. I counted them because my mind had long ago learned to measure the precise dimensions of the spaces where I was expected to remain invisible. The iron framework of the ceiling arched high above, catching the relentless drum of the winter rain. Beneath it, the silence in the room had grown so absolute that the click of my heels against the cold marble floor sounded like a gavel. I moved forward. The air in the pavilion was heavy. It was chilled by the glass panels overlooking the dark rain-swept lake. Yet I felt no cold. As I approached the main tables, the sea of tailored suits and silk ties seemed to part. Men who had spent their entire lives commanding territories now stood perfectly still, watching me walk across the room. Dante sat at the head of his table. His hand gripped the stem of a crystal water glass so tightly that his knuckles had turned completely white. His jaw was locked. For years I had watched him navigate these summits with an arrogant ease. He believed that his authority was an unshakable fortress. Now that fortress was crumbling under the weight of his own miscalculation. He couldn't shout. He couldn't command me to return to a seat he had deliberately refused to provide. Marco, sitting in the chair that should have been mine, kept his eyes fixed firmly on the linen tablecloth. He was suddenly understanding the catastrophic nature of his promotion. I didn't pause. I simply glided past his frozen figure with complete measured grace. A fraction of an inch separated the hem of my dress from his polished shoes. Yet the chasm between us had just expanded into an ocean. At the adjacent table, the elderly patriarch waited. Don Silvano Carrese didn't gesture toward a peripheral spot. Instead, he placed a steady hand on the carved mahogany back of the velvet guest chair. It was a plush, high-backed seat positioned squarely at the head of his family's delegation. It was the position reserved exclusively for the most revered visiting dignitary. He pulled it out slowly, and the heavy wooden legs glided soundlessly over the marble. I turned and lowered myself into the plush upholstery. The fabric was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing draft sweeping through the glass walls. I smoothed the skirt of my dress as Silvano gave a slow, respectful nod. He adjusted the lapels of his charcoal suit before taking the seat to my right. I kept my gaze steady, looking out over the flickering candlelight that reflected against the storm outside. A quiet clarity settled over my pulse. He took his seat. His rivals took my side. The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Across the table, 3 senior captains, men with silver hair and decades of brutal history, adjusted their posture. They sat up straighter, folding their hands above the table. There were no hushed whispers. There was only the absolute, undeniable focus of a syndicate that understood the true architecture of power. A waiter in a crisp white jacket approached with cautious reverence. He carried a silver tray bearing a delicate porcelain set. With practiced care, he placed a saucer before me, followed by the jasmine teacup. The fragile gold-rimmed ceramic felt entirely out of place in a room filled with heavy crystal tumblers. Yet it commanded the center of the arrangement. A thin ribbon of fragrant steam rose from the amber liquid. It carried the scent of jasmine into the chilled air. I rested my fingertips against the warm porcelain around the table. The waiter poured espresso for the other men. Once the silver tray was withdrawn, a heavy stillness fell over the Carezzi delegation. I waited, expecting the patriarch to open the discussions. Instead, Don Silvano sat perfectly still, and his espresso remained untouched. The other captains mirrored his stillness, their hands resting patiently on the white linen. It took a moment to recognize the old-world protocol being enacted. In this strictly traditional hierarchy, no one drank before the guest of honor. Silvano was forcing the entire room to witness his deference. He waited for me. I lifted the jasmine teacup, the gold rim cool against my lower lip, and took a slow, measured sip. Only as I set the delicate cup back into its saucer, with a soft porcelain click, did Silvano reach for his espresso. The rest of his table followed. The elderly Don murmured. His voice was a low rumble that carried effortlessly over the sound of the rain. The weather makes the roads treacherous this time of year, but the harbor terminals, they remain clear, do they not? It wasn't a casual observation. It was a calculated opening move. The summit's most critical negotiation had just begun. The eastern docks are fully operational, I explained, tracing the handle of my cup. However, the primary shipping lanes require a more structured oversight during the winter months. The current logistics agreements failed to account for the delays caused by the ice. Silvano leaned forward slightly. He rested his forearms on the white linen. And how would you restructure those agreements if the authority were entirely yours to shape? He was bypassing my husband completely. For 5 years, I had quietly managed the ledgers, coordinated the shipments, and maintained the fragile alliances that kept the regional trade flowing. Dante had assumed those systems ran themselves. He had treated my labor as invisible. It was an automatic service requiring neither gratitude nor respect. The southern route must be secured first, I explained, tracing the handle of my cup. The current delays are unacceptable. If we implement a shared manifest system across the 3 main terminals, the bottlenecks will dissolve within a week. The men around the table nodded slowly, absorbing the precise logistical reality of my proposal. There was no condescension in their eyes. There was only the sharp, calculating recognition of competence. They were looking at the true architect of the harbor's peace. From the velvet chair at Don Silvano's right, the entire architecture of the Grand Conservatory was visible in the reflection of the towering glass walls. The vaulted ceiling, a complex lattice of wrought iron and rain-slicked glass, cast the golden light of the chandeliers down onto the dining floor. I didn't need to turn my head to see the exact moment. Dante's power began to bleed out onto the white linen of his table. The first course had arrived. It was a delicate white fish resting in a pool of dark, savory broth. But the men seated around my husband were no longer hungry for his words. For 5 years, Dante had commanded these winter summits with a sharp modern gravity. He operated under the assumption that fear, aggressive logistics, and money were the only currencies that mattered. He had forgotten that the old men who ruled this syndicate, the men who had survived decades of blood and betrayal, measured a man's reliability entirely by how he guarded his own foundation. Now, as Dante leaned forward, attempting to outline a crucial shipment route to the patriarchs of the Northern Territories, I watched their shoulders angle slightly away from him. It was a microscopic shift. It was a subtle adjustment of posture, or a slow, deliberate gaze into a wine glass while he was still speaking. In our world, open defiance was rare and vulgar, but polite indifference was a death sentence. They looked at Marco Valletti, who sat rigidly in my traditional chair. Marco's face had drained of color. He had finally realized that occupying the wife's seat didn't elevate him to an equal standing. It merely proved his boss possessed no honor. The older captains didn't respect Marco for being there. They pitied him. I watched the younger man struggle to eat, his silver fork scraping too loudly against the fine china. The sound echoed awkwardly in the terrible silence of their section. The other leaders despised Dante for forcing them to witness such a crass display of domestic disrespect. Dante's voice faltered, losing its usual heavy baritone rhythm. He paused, picking up a silver decanter to pour a glass of red wine for the underboss of the Luciano family. The underboss simply raised his hand, covering the rim of his crystal glass. It was a silent, devastating refusal of hospitality. Dante set the heavy decanter down. He reached out to adjust the pristine silverware he hadn't yet used. His fingers drifted toward the gold-trimmed edge of the maroon place card, sitting perfectly centered above his empty plate. Even from across the vast, rain-swept room, I could see the rigid tension locked in his jaw. His thumb pressed against the expensive cardstock. He rolled the edge backward, pressing his nail into the fiber until the stiff paper snapped. He tore the corner of his own name. It was a tiny, violent movement, hidden beneath the shadow of the crystal centerpieces. He was a man realizing that he had just locked himself out of his own empire, and he had done it merely to prove he held the keys. The waiters began to silently clear the plates, signaling the summit's formal recess before the treaty negotiations. The heavy oak doors leading to the adjoining gallery opened. They allowed the damp, cedar-scented air from the lake to circulate through the heated pavilion. I excused myself from Don Silvano with a slight respectful nod and walked into the shadowed corridor of the glass walk. The winter rain was heavier now. It streaked the dark panes in long, erratic paths, distorting the lights of the city across the water. I stood perfectly still, watching the weather and feeling the cool draft against my skin. The heavy, aggressive thud of leather shoes on marble announced him long before he spoke. Dante didn't walk with the measured, quiet grace of the older men. He walked like a man who believed the floor belonged to him by right. He stopped 2 feet away, disrupting the quiet rhythm of the rain. The heat radiating from his suppressed anger felt entirely useless against the chill of the gallery. "You are making a spectacle of this family," he said. His voice was a low, controlled hiss designed to stay within the stone walls of the corridor. "You will walk back into that dining room. You will excuse yourself to the Carisi patriarch, and you will take a seat behind Marco. He didn't offer me my chair back. He only demanded my absolute humiliating compliance." I turned my head slowly. I didn't look at his angry eyes. I looked down at his hands. I saw the slight, uncontrolled tremor in his fingers. The same fingers that had ruined the place card moments before. He was waiting for me to argue. He was waiting for the familiar, frantic rhythm of a wife begging for her rightful place, crying over the embarrassment. But the woman who would have fought for a seat at his table had stopped existing somewhere between his arrogant arrival and this cold hallway. "The treaty signing is in 20 minutes, Dante pressed, stepping closer. He tried to use his broad physical size to eclipse the light from the gallery. It was a primitive tactic of intimidation. "Do not humiliate me in front of my allies." I raised my hand and smoothed the cuff of my dark silk sleeve. I aligned the fine fabric with exact precision. "Your allies have already made their judgment, Dante, and I didn't have to say a single word to help them reach it." His jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched beneath his skin. He reached out, his hand hovering over my arm. He was caught between the violent instinct to grab me and the sudden terrifying realization that he no longer possessed the right to touch me. He dropped his hand, curling it into a fist against his side. "We are supposed to be a united front. We have an agreement. We have peace." I looked up at his face. Then the silence stretched between us. It was thicker and heavier than the reinforced glass separating us from the storm outside. He honestly believed that because I hadn't screamed, because I hadn't caused a scene, my return to his shadow was still guaranteed. The recess concluded with the heavy sound of the estate's mahogany doors sealing shut. Outside, the winter rain lashed against the glass panels. It created a relentless rhythm that fractured the light from the chandeliers. Inside, the established order of the syndicate was quietly realigning itself. I remained seated in the velvet guest chair at the Carisi table. Across the table, Don Silvano Carisi raised a hand. His counselor stepped forward and slid a thick leather-bound folder across the white linen. It came to rest exactly between Silvano and me. It was the preliminary draft of the Harbor Terminal Treaty. Every month, I had quietly recalculated the tonnages and fixed the logistical blind spots of Dante's captains while my husband slept. Dante had simply assumed his empire managed itself. He had mistaken my invisible labor for their competence. Now I let my eyes drift down the fresh pages Marco Valetti had prepared without my oversight. "The southern loading docks," I pointed out, my fingertip resting on a timestamp. "Marco has scheduled the deep water freighters to dock during the third week's neap tide. This ignores the silt buildup in the old canal. The ships will bottom out before reaching the cranes." I traced the transit line with a manicured nail. "They will sit exposed in the channel for 6 hours. Waiting for the evening swell. Any rival faction could walk across the mud and claim the cargo." Silvano didn't speak. His dark eyes followed my finger, absorbing the massive security exposure that Dante's senior captain had missed. The heavy gold rings on Silvano's hand glinted as he slowly traced his jawline. The silence stretching between us was profound. It wasn't the patronizing silence of an elder indulging a slighted wife. It was the stark, calculating silence of a strategist recognizing a true equal. 6 hours of exposure, Silvano repeated softly. A fatal oversight. "A completely avoidable one," I corrected gently. I picked up a borrowed fountain pen. Without looking across the room to see if my husband was watching, I began to adjust the maritime logistics. I crossed out Marco's timestamps, writing the correct title windows in the margins with practiced efficiency. I didn't smile. I simply watched the ink dry on the page. My competence was no longer a hidden foundation holding up Dante's house. It was out in the open, sitting at the table of his greatest rival. Across the vast expanse of the conservatory, the atmosphere around the Marone table was rapidly deteriorating. The waitstaff had cleared the banquet plates, signaling the start of the formal ratification phase. Traditionally, this was the hour when the regional bosses would gather around Dante's chair to finalize seasonal transit fees. I paused my writing, lifting my chin to observe the room. The delegates from the northern ports and inland routes stood up from their tables. They smoothed their suit jackets, but they didn't walk toward Dante. Instead, they moved with measured steps across the marble floor, slowly gravitating toward the Carisi table. They formed a quiet and respectful perimeter around Don Silvano and me, waiting to speak. At his own table, Dante adjusted his cuffs. His posture was rigid. He projected an authority that the room was actively deciding to ignore. The Marone place card sat crisp and white on the table. It was a useless piece of stationery marking an empty boundary. He gestured sharply to his left. Marco stepped forward. The captain's usual swagger was entirely gone. He navigated the space between the tables and approached the perimeter of bosses standing near me. "Gentlemen," Marco said. His tone was strained, lacking its usual sharp edge. "Don Marone is ready to review your terminal access. Please follow me back to our table." The delegate from the Boston syndicate simply shook his head. He didn't raise his voice or offer an insult. He merely tilted his head toward the leather folder resting under my hand. Marco's shoulders dropped. The aggressive man who had taken my traditional seat just 2 hours ago now looked completely unmanned. He had the Marone name. But they all knew who held the logistical map that guaranteed their survival. Marco turned away, walking the long distance back across the floor to where Dante sat alone. The physical distance gave me a perfect, silent view of the exchange. Marco leaned down over Dante's shoulder. His hands, usually animated when he spoke, remained flat against his sides. Dante's face tightened instantly. A dark flush crept over his collar, visible even in the muted lighting. Marco was delivering the message. The other families were refusing to negotiate the transit routes with him. They would only discuss the logistics if I was at the table. Dante stared at the polished wood of his empty table. His hand closed around his crystal water glass, and the knuckles turned a sharp, bloodless white. The water inside rippled slightly. It betrayed the tremor of a man realizing his power was an illusion. Then his gaze snapped upward, tracking across the room until it locked onto me. The rigidity in his shoulders collapsed. It left only the posture of an emperor realizing the architecture of his empire had always belonged to someone else. Before stepping back, Marco turned his head slightly. He looked past Dante, and his eyes found me across the sea of white linen. Slowly and deliberately, the senior captain lowered his chin in a deep, formal nod of respect. The loyalty of the syndicate was shifting. It wasn't changing through loud demands. It was changing through the undeniable gravity of competence. I set the pen down, my hands perfectly still, and prepared to dictate the terms of peace. The low hum of conversation inside the glass pavilion eventually faded. It gave way to the steady, rhythmic drumming of the winter storm against the high iron-framed windows. The banquet had reached its end, and the delicate porcelain plates were quietly cleared away by the serving staff. It was time for the architecture of the truce to be formalized. At the head of the table, Don Silvano Carezzi wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He folded it meticulously and placed it beside his empty saucer. He didn't ask for silence. The room simply provided it. The elderly patriarch possessed the kind of gravity that modern men could never purchase. He gestured slightly with one weathered hand. An aide immediately stepped forward from the shadows, carrying a thick leather folio. The folio was laid flat against the dark mahogany surface. When it opened, it revealed the finalized harbor terminal treaty. It wasn't merely a document. It was the lifeblood of the entire regional syndicate. It outlined the logistics, the safe passage routes, and the exact distribution of the coastal freight. For 5 years, I had quietly managed the administrative realities of those docks. I knew the shift schedules, the union delegates, and the precise weight limits of the cargo cranes. My husband only knew the final revenue numbers that appeared in his bank accounts. Silvano adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the heavy parchment, scanning the paragraphs of formal agreements and the blank lines waiting for signatures. Then he reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen. He didn't uncap it. Instead, he placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of the treaty. The northern families have reviewed the terms of this peace, Silvano began. His voice was raspy, but entirely clear, carrying across the cold expanse of the conservatory. We are prepared to guarantee safe passage through the regional harbor terminals. We are prepared to cease all hostilities along the transport routes. Dante sat up straighter at his table across the room. I could see the faint gleam of triumph in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he had won. Beside him, Marco Valetti relaxed his shoulders, a small relieved exhale escaping his lips. They both believed the business was concluded. They believed the exclusion of my presence had carried no cost. However, Silvano continued, letting the word hang in the chilled air. Trust is not given to men who don't understand the foundations of their own empires. A man who casually discards the architect of his house cannot be trusted to uphold the walls of ours. The patriarch turned his head slowly. His gaze drifted from Dante's table to rest respectfully upon me. The Carezzi family will not recognize Dante Marone's authority over the logistics, Silvano announced. The stillness in the room suddenly felt suffocating. We will only guarantee this truce on one condition. Clarissa Marone must remain the primary trustee of the ports. At his own table, Dante froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and entirely lost. Marcos stared blankly at the floral centerpiece. He was realizing the catastrophic depth of their miscalculation. Silvano tapped a single finger against the heavy parchment. There is a line missing on this page, he stated softly. I will not sign my name until a signature line for Clarissa Marone is formally added. He pushed the treaty forward, leaving it untouched. The message was absolute. The rival Don had used the strictest rules of formal trade to cement my autonomy. He neutralized my husband's ability to retaliate without plunging his own syndicate into ruin. The silence stretching across the grand conservatory was absolute. It was heavy with the scent of rain, damp wool, and shifting power. An aide immediately stepped to the table. A silver ruler was placed against the bottom edge of the parchment. A fresh, straight black line was drawn beneath the existing ones. My name was printed below it in sharp, exacting letters. Don Silvano Carezzi looked across the vast expanse of the marble floor, and his eyes fixed directly on my husband. The choice presented to Dante was brutal in its simplicity. He could step forward and sign the amendment, publicly transferring the operational authority of the port terminals to me. Or he could refuse, forfeiting the truce entirely. This would leave his family isolated, bankrupt, and vulnerable to an unwinnable war. For a long moment, Dante didn't move. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control. He relied on the quiet, invisible labor of others to sustain his image. To accept this condition was to admit his dependence in front of the most powerful men in the city. Slowly, Dante stood, and his chair scraped loudly against the polished stone floor. In the quiet elegance of the pavilion, it was an ugly, jarring sound. He walked across the room. The distance between the table where he had tried to erase me and the table where I now sat as a guest of honor must have felt like miles. Every eye in the conservatory watched him. The older dons observed him with quiet, unyielding judgment. They measured the modern, careless boy who had mistaken petty cruelty for strength. When Dante finally reached the edge of the Carezzi table, he stopped. He didn't look at me. He kept his gaze locked entirely on the document resting on the mahogany surface. The harbor terminal treaty lay there, perfectly illuminated by the glow of the overhead chandeliers. It exposed the exact consequence of his actions. Silvano's aide offered Dante a pen. He reached out to take it. As he hovered his hand over the heavy parchment, I watched his knuckles turn white. His fingers were normally so steady when adjusting his expensive cufflinks or ordering his men around. Now they trembled slightly under the crushing weight of the room's gaze. A single drop of dark ink threatened to fall from the nib, suspended by nothing but tension. I didn't smile. I didn't offer him a reassuring glance. I simply sat with perfect composure. I watched a man who had always taken my loyalty for granted finally experience the exact emptiness he had created. Dante pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of the ink against the thick page was painfully loud. He signed his name, formally surrendering his claim. As he lifted the pen, the realization washed over his features, stark and undeniable. He hadn't been defeated by a rival army or a clever trap. He had signed his own defeat in ink. His public humiliation was completely his own doing. By deliberately removing my chair to prove his dominance, he had handed me the keys to his entire empire. He lowered his hand, standing silently in the shadow of the table where he had refused to let me sit. The heavy oak doors of the main venue closed, sealing out the low rumble of the departing engines. The winter summit was officially over. Inside the massive glass pavilion, the atmosphere shifted rapidly from tense political theater to an echoing, hollow quiet. The rain against the high-arched ceiling had hardened into sleet, tapping relentlessly against the iron frames. The long mahogany tables, recently crowded with the most dangerous men in the region, now sat abandoned. They were scattered with crumpled linen napkins, left behind dossiers, and half-empty crystal water glasses. A stray draft drifted through the room, carrying the faint metallic scent of winter and dying fireplace embers. Dante lingered near the center of the room. His usual commanding posture had collapsed into something rigid and uncertain. He watched me standing near the far window, and my dark coat was sharply outlined by the freezing night beyond the glass. He expected me to scream. He expected a storm of recriminations, a demand for an apology, or at least the fierce, protective anger that usually followed a public betrayal. Instead, I was completely still. Gemma moved quietly through the shadows of the pavilion, gathering the remnants of the evening. The housekeeper's footsteps were soft on the cold marble floor as she approached the small side table. This was where my personal items had been placed earlier that evening. "Clarissa," Dante began. His voice echoed too loudly in the cavernous space. He took a hesitant step forward, and his expensive leather shoes clicked against the stone. What happened tonight was a miscalculation. Marco needed to be seen at the table for the waterfront men. It was never about diminishing you. I can fix this. We can renegotiate the internal structure tomorrow. He was still speaking the language of contracts and public perception. His hands, usually steady and authoritative, flexed awkwardly at his sides. He was a man accustomed to buying loyalty. He was entirely unequipped to handle a woman who no longer required his provision. He had just surrendered a massive portion of his logistics empire to keep the peace. Yet he still believed the fracture in his marriage was merely an administrative error waiting to be corrected. I turned my head. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer him the relief of my fury. "There is nothing left to negotiate, Dante," I said softly. I looked down at the small marble table beside me. Resting on the polished stone was the jasmine teacup Gemma had poured hours ago. She expected me to need my usual evening comfort while I waited on the sidelines. It had sat there through the entire summit. It was entirely forgotten by the man who claimed to protect me, and untouched by the wife who no longer needed it. I didn't pick the cup up. I simply withdrew my hand, leaving the porcelain resting on the freezing stone. "Gemma," I said, my tone gentle and measured, "you can leave that one. I won't be needing it anymore." The housekeeper paused. Her eyes flickered toward Dante before she gave a slow, understanding nod. She picked up her silver tray and walked away, leaving the abandoned cup exactly where it was. Dante stared at the cold porcelain. The reality of the gesture hit him harder than any shouted insult. Anger meant there was still a negotiation. Sadness meant there was still an emotional tether. But this absolute, composed indifference meant that the invisible foundation of his life had just been permanently removed. "You are my wife," he said, his voice dropping into a desperate hollow rasp. "You belong at my estate." "I belong to a man who respected my presence," I answered, my gaze sweeping over the empty room. "That man didn't save me a seat tonight, so I found my own." I turned my back on him and walked toward the grand exit. My footsteps were slow, measured, and entirely free of hesitation. The powerful boss didn't follow me. He remained rooted to the marble floor, trapped in the center of the massive glass pavilion. He was surrounded by the empty chairs of men who no longer respected him. I pushed open the heavy iron-wrought doors and stepped out into the biting winter air. The sleet had transitioned into a quiet, steady snowfall. It dusted the manicured grounds of the estate in a layer of pristine white. The freezing wind stung my cheeks, but the atmosphere felt remarkably clean. The gravel driveway crunched softly beneath my boots as I descended the sweeping stone staircase. Along the pathway, the estate's famous winter garden stood in quiet defiance of the frost. Dark red roses, cultivated specifically to survive the bitter New York winters, pushed through the accumulating snow. I paused to look at them. Their vivid crimson petals were stark against the freezing white landscape. They were beautiful, resilient, and entirely self-sufficient. A sleek black town car idled at the base of the steps. It wasn't one of Dante's armored SUVs. It was a vehicle arranged by my own private security. This was a detail I had quietly secured under my maiden name weeks ago, when the neglect had first become undeniable. The driver, a quiet man who reported only to me, stepped out and opened the rear door with a respectful nod. Before slipping into the heated interior, I turned around to look through the massive rain-streaked glass walls of the towering structure. I could still see my husband. He was standing exactly where I had left him, staring down at the small marble table and the cold teacup. He looked small. He was a man who had traded his most loyal ally for a momentary display of petty power, only to lose both his empire and his home in a single evening. I felt a brief, hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't for the man standing in the room, but for the years I had spent trying to make myself small enough to fit beside him. That ache, too, was fading. It was rapidly being replaced by the solid, undeniable weight of the Harbor Terminal Treaty, resting safely inside my leather portfolio. The conditional peace I had secured was entirely on my own terms, protected by my own authority. The future didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like an open road stretching out into the quiet, snow-covered night. I slid into the back seat of the car. The heavy door closed with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the cold. As the vehicle pulled away from the estate, the tires carving fresh tracks into the untouched snow, I leaned back against the warm leather. Love is rarely lost in one terrible moment. It slowly disappears through ordinary choices. Dante had made his choice when he removed my name from the table. I had made mine when I decided to never let him dictate my place again.